The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, cameras flashing in every direction, voices echoing with curiosity. At the center of it all stood Kalen, the man whose name alone could shift markets, holding the hand of a woman who looked nothing like the polished elites surrounding them. Ilara's coat was plain, her hair still damp from the rain outside, yet her presence carried a quiet strength that silenced the room more effectively than any speech. Reporters pushed forward, microphones stretched, each demanding an answer. Kalen's gaze swept across them, steady and unflinching, before settling on the woman beside him. His hand tightened over hers, not in fear but in defiance. "She's the one who taught me what I never knew," his voice rang out, firm but gentle. "That nothing is too broken to be repaired. Not even me." The crowd gasped, whispers swirling through the hall, but Kalen's expression didn't waver. In that instant, the billionaire who once measured worth in numbers revealed something greater, a truth born not of wealth, but of a bond that had mended a life. But how did a man who seemed to have everything find himself standing in that moment, declaring that a woman from the streets had given him what wealth could not? How did a girl who once shivered on cold benches, fixing broken toys for children at the shelter, end up in the spotlight, holding the hand of a man whose life was built on power and prestige? Stories like these don't begin in ballrooms or under glittering lights. They start in the forgotten corners of the city, where hardship shapes character, and in the quiet spaces of a mansion, where silence can be heavier than gold. Today, you and I will step into their world, not through headlines, not through gossip, but through the moments that built a connection stronger than reputation. This is not just the tale of a homeless girl and a billionaire. It is the account of two broken lives, colliding by chance, stitched together by something simple, yet powerful, the courage to care when no one else would. So settle in. Let me take you back to the storm that changed everything. Welcome, my friends, to Tales by Williams. I'm grateful you've chosen to spend your time here today. I want to pray for everyone around the world watching this video. May calmness surround your mind, may the weight you carry be lifted, and may strength rise within you. May you feel seen, valued, and cared for, knowing that even in the quiet hours you are never forgotten. May light guide your steps and joy return to your soul. Amen. Whether this is your first visit or you've been with us before, know that you are part of a circle where stories carry both heart and purpose. Here, every story is more than just entertainment. It's a reflection of life itself, its trials, its fragile hopes, and the moments of courage that change everything. I believe stories have the power not only to move us, but also to teach us, to remind us that no matter where we come from, we all long for connection, for healing, for love that feels real. The tale you're about to hear is one of those rare journeys, not of glittering perfection, but of two lives that began in brokenness and somehow found light in each other. It's a reminder that sometimes the people we least expect become the ones who shape us the most. So, sit back, let the world outside fall silent for a while, and allow this story to speak to you in its own way. Before we step fully into this journey, I have a small request. Stories like these, filled with love, courage, and lessons we can carry into our own lives, deserve to be shared. And the more people we can reach together, the more hearts we can touch. So if you haven't already, take a moment right now to subscribe to Tales by Williams. That single click helps this community grow, making sure you never miss the stories that remind us of what truly matters. While you're at it, don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoy this kind of storytelling, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters here, and I'd love to hear from you. And of course, if this story moves you, share it with a friend or loved one who could use a reminder that hope, kindness, and love can be found in the most unexpected places. Now, with that said, let's step back into the storm, where one encounter would begin to repair two lives forever. Ilara's nights were long and often cold. She had no bedroom waiting for her, no sheets pulled tight, no lamp glowing softly at her side. Instead, her bed was a wooden bench tucked beneath the shelter of an overhang, where the city's wind howled like a restless animal. A tattered coat was her only shield, threadbare at the sleeves, but she clutched it tightly all the same. It wasn't much, yet it was hers. Hunger gnawed at her more often than she cared to admit, but she refused to let desperation define her. When others looked at broken objects and turned away, she reached for them. A chair missing a screw, a toy with a snapped wheel, a lamp with wires exposed. She saw possibilities where others saw trash. At the shelter, children often brought her their treasures: a doll with a torn arm, a guitar missing strings, a watch that had long stopped ticking. With careful hands and quiet patience, she gave them back hope, one repaired object at a time. It wasn't just about fixing things. Each mended toy meant a child's laughter. Each tightened bolt meant a mother could sit down without fear of collapse. These tiny acts of restoration were her way of fighting against the weight of life pressing down on her. She could not control where she slept or how many meals she had, but she could control this: her ability to make broken things useful again. The city around her often passed her by as if she were invisible. People hurried along, eyes fixed on glowing screens or polished shoes, never pausing to notice the girl bent over a cracked frame or tangled wire. And yet, Alara was never entirely bitter. She found purpose in the small victories, and those victories stitched her will together. Her hands were her greatest tool, steady despite the cold, persistent despite the weariness that settled deep in her bones. She carried a small toolkit everywhere she went, a collection of screwdrivers, pliers, and thread. It was heavy for her frail shoulders, but she would never part with it. To others it looked like junk. To her it was dignity. It was proof that even without a home she could still give something valuable to the world. And in the quiet moments, after she had tightened the last screw or mended the last seam, she would sit back, breathe into the night air, and whisper to herself a reminder: as long as I can fix something, I'm not useless. I still matter. While Alara's nights were defined by benches and borrowed warmth, Kaylin's were wrapped in silk sheets and guarded by glass towers that stretched high above the city. To the world, he was the image of triumph, a man whose empire sprawled across industries, whose name commanded respect, whose face appeared on magazine covers with captions like "the visionary of the century." His calendar was a blur of meetings, galas, and interviews. Every handshake was firm, every smile rehearsed, every word calculated, but the applause never followed him home. Behind the grand entrance of his penthouse, past the polished marble floors and artwork worth millions, was silence. A silence that grew heavier the higher his wealth climbed. He could summon assistance at a touch of a button, order delicacies flown in from across the globe, and surround himself with the rarest possessions. But none of it filled the emptiness that crept into his chest each night. Trophies lined his shelves, awards for business innovation, plaques celebrating record-breaking deals. Yet to him, they were reminders, not triumphs. Each one whispered the same truth: you've gained everything the world told you to chase, and still you are alone. He told himself that success was supposed to feel like this, that the sacrifices he had made were necessary. He had traded friendships for contracts, laughter for strategy sessions, and love for the cold embrace of ambition. The world believed him unstoppable, but he knew the truth. He had built an empire so vast that it isolated him from the simplest of human needs. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when his facade cracked. Sometimes it was at a boardroom celebration, when clinking glasses and hollow congratulations felt like an echo chamber. Sometimes it was when he stared out of his window late at night, the city lights blinking below like distant stars. In those moments he felt like a man perched on a tower so high that no one could reach him, and no one truly tried. Kaylin's life was comfort without connection, privilege without peace. People wanted what he had, but no one asked how much it cost him to carry it. He was a man admired by thousands, yet known by none. And while Alara patched broken toys to bring children joy, Kaylin sat surrounded by luxuries that could not mend the loneliness that shadowed him. For all his billions, he could not buy the one thing his heart longed for: the warmth of being seen, not for his empire, but for his humanity. Alara and Kaylin lived in the same city, yet their worlds could not have been further apart. For her, life was measured in survival, finding a dry place to rest, holding on to a warm meal when one appeared, and guarding the little dignity she had left. For him, life was measured in acquisitions, securing another company, adding another award to his shelf, and ensuring his name remained at the top of financial headlines. Their paths might never have crossed if fate had not insisted on closing the distance between them. She moved unseen through crowded streets, eyes fixed on the next broken item that needed fixing. He moved through the same streets in sleek cars with tinted windows, hidden from view as though the city itself were beneath him. She carried her toolkit, heavy but essential. He carried a phone, constantly buzzing with reminders, each message another demand on his time. Yet for all their differences, there was an invisible thread that bound them: loneliness. Ilara's loneliness was raw, formed by absence, no family to turn to, no roof to call her own. Kaylin's loneliness was disguised, hidden beneath luxury, surrounded by people who wanted his wealth but cared nothing for the man behind it. She found purpose in restoring what was discarded. He found emptiness in everything that was new and flawless. She longed for a place to belong. He longed for someone who saw beyond his empire. Two souls at opposite extremes, each defined by what they lacked, each unaware that the other carried the missing piece. The city itself reflected their divide. Ilara's nights were framed by flickering street lamps, where shadows stretched across cracked sidewalks. Kaylin's nights were lit by chandeliers, where every surface gleamed with polish. One world smelled of damp pavement and stale bread. The other smelled of imported wine and polished wood. And yet, beneath these differences lay the same human truth. Both hearts beat with the quiet ache of wanting more than what their worlds offered. Neither knew it yet, but the collision of their lives would not just bridge two worlds. It would challenge the very definitions of worth, love, and repair. Ilara's life was a daily lesson in grit. Each morning she woke with stiff muscles and an empty stomach, yet she forced herself to move, to keep searching for something worth repairing. She endured the stares of strangers who judged her by her worn coat and the way she carried her heavy toolkit. Still, she kept her head lifted, reminding herself that dignity was not something the world could strip away. It was a choice she made every day. Her strength was quiet, unspoken, carved out of necessity, and though loneliness pressed hard against her, she resisted despair by pouring what little she had into acts of kindness. Kaylin's life was the opposite. On paper, he had everything: wealth, recognition, influence. But what others envied only deepened the emptiness within him. His days were filled with meetings, contracts, and endless voices telling him how remarkable he was. Yet not one of those voices ever asked about his happiness. The applause rang hollow, echoing in rooms that felt colder with every celebration. His wealth insulated him from hardship, but it also walled him off from the warmth of authentic human connection. The contrast between them was sharp. Ilara's grit came from survival. Kaylin's hollow wealth came from excess. She endured loneliness because the world had abandoned her. He endured loneliness because the world would not leave him alone. Her life demanded resilience. His life demanded performance. And yet, beneath the differences, the same ache throbbed in their chests, the need to be seen. For Ilara, it was the hope that someone would recognize her worth beyond her ragged coat. For Kaylin, it was the hope that someone would look past his fortune and see the man inside the suit. It was this shared hunger, buried beneath layers of hardship and privilege, that set the stage for their meeting. Two people who seemed destined never to belong to the same story were already bound by an invisible truth. Both carried wounds that no money, no talent, and no circumstance alone could repair. The storm struck without warning. Rain fell in sheets, pounding against the pavement as if the sky itself had split open. The city streets emptied quickly, with umbrellas flipping inside out and headlights cutting through the downpour. Kaylin's sleek black car pushed forward, defying the weather, until suddenly it lurched and coughed before grinding to a halt near an abandoned block. Frustration surged through him. He tapped the dashboard, as if sheer willpower might revive the machine, but the engine only hissed in defiance. He pressed his phone against his ear. No answer. His driver was off duty, his assistant unavailable, and the service line placed him on hold. Raindrops hammered the windshield, drowning out the recorded voice promising help will be on the way. Outside, water streamed down the cracked sidewalks, pooling around rusted drains. Kaylin glanced at his reflection in the side mirror, a man trapped in a luxury vehicle that suddenly seemed powerless against nature. His suit was immaculate, but what use was polish when stranded in the storm? That was when he noticed movement. A slender figure hurrying along the street, shoulders hunched, clutching something against her chest. At first he thought she would pass by without a glance, but as the thunder cracked overhead she slowed, her gaze catching on the stalled car. And then, through the pounding rain, her voice carried softly, almost swallowed by the storm. "I can repair it." Kalen blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly through the roar of the storm. He turned his head and saw her clearly now, a young woman soaked to the bone, strands of wet hair clinging to her face. Her coat was threadbare, the kind of garment no one would look at twice in a store window. Yet in her hands, she held a small, worn toolkit, its metal edges glinting faintly in the rain. "You?" Kalen asked, his tone a mixture of disbelief and irritation. The question slipped out before he could stop himself. He had seen mechanics in crisp uniforms, garages filled with machines and lifts. But this girl? She looked as though she barely had the strength to stay standing in the downpour, let alone bring an expensive engine back to life. But her eyes didn't falter. They held no hesitation, no trace of mockery. "Machines don't care about titles," she said, her voice steady though soft. "They just need someone willing to see what's broken." Kalen hesitated. The storm battered the car, and his phone remained silent. There was something in her calmness that unsettled him, not weakness but certainty. She stood there as though the storm didn't matter, as though she belonged in front of that car, tools in hand. Against every instinct, Kalen felt the first flicker of curiosity. Who was she, this fragile figure with unshakable confidence? Alara knelt by the hood without hesitation, rainwater running down her sleeves as she opened the latch with practiced hands. Kalen stood back, his polished shoes sinking into shallow puddles, watching in disbelief. She worked quickly, movements precise, as though she had done this 100 times before. Her fingers tightened bolts, adjusted wires, and checked connections with a concentration that left Kalen oddly silent. No fumbling, no hesitation, only a quiet rhythm, the sound of tools clicking against metal blending with the storm. She was soaked through, shivering slightly, but her hands never faltered. Minutes later, a spark flared. The engine coughed, then roared back to life, the low hum steady and strong. Kalen's brows rose. Mechanics at his own garages sometimes took hours, yet this girl had brought his car back from the brink in mere moments. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a crisp bill, the kind that could feed someone like her for days. He extended it toward her, certain she would snatch it gratefully. But Alara only shook her head, closing her toolkit. "I don't need that," she said firmly, though her voice was still soft. She turned to walk away, her figure shrinking into the storm. For the first time in years, Kalen found himself at a loss for words. The car's steady hum should have been the relief Kalen needed. On any other night, the problem would have ended there. Engine fixed, payment given, and life moving forward without a second thought. But as he stood in the rain, watching Alara's retreating figure, he realized the repair itself meant less than the way she had walked away. People never refused him. Not his offers, not his money, not his influence. His wealth had always been the final word, a force that bent situations to his will. Yet this girl, drenched, shivering, with nothing but a battered toolkit, had looked him in the eye and turned, away from the very thing most would have fought to grab. It unsettled him. He could not decide if it was pride, stubbornness, or something far deeper. For once, Kalen found himself without control. The hum of the engine felt hollow, a noise that did little to drown out the louder echo in his chest. Why did she refuse me? That night, as the car carried him back to his penthouse, her words lingered louder than the storm. Machines don't care about titles. They just need someone willing to see what's broken. And for reasons he could not explain, Kalen felt that she had not been speaking only about the car. And that, my friends, was the first spark. The moment a girl with nothing but determination crossed paths with a man who thought he already had everything. Her refusal of his money unsettled him more than the breakdown itself. It was not the repair that changed him, but the truth hidden in her choice. Some acts of kindness are too pure to be bought. Now, let me pause here and ask you a question, because I want this story to feel personal to you as well. Imagine being in Alara's shoes, cold, soaked through, stomach empty, and handed money that could ease the burden for days. Would you have taken it, or would you have walked away as she did? There is no right or wrong answer, only the honesty of your own heart. Some might accept the money out of necessity, while others might refuse to protect their dignity. Both choices carry weight. I'd love to hear your perspective. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Would you have taken the payment, or would you have walked away? Your voice matters, and your reflections could inspire someone else listening tonight. And remember, this is just the beginning of their story. The storm passed, but the memory of that night refused to leave Kalen. He had returned to his penthouse, changed into dry clothes, and yet, even with the hum of city lights outside his window, his mind replayed her words. Machines don't care about titles. They just need someone willing to see what's broken. It was absurd, he told himself. She was just a stranger, someone who fixed his car and walked away. But when morning came, and the sun painted gold across his skyline, the emptiness felt sharper. For years he had filled silence with work, but now it was filled with questions. Who was she? Why had she refused his money? For the first time in years, Kalen cleared his schedule. Instead of heading to the boardroom, he found himself driving through neighborhoods he had never cared to visit. He walked into shelters, asking quietly if anyone had seen a girl with a small toolkit. Staff raised eyebrows, unsure why a man in an expensive suit would be searching for someone like her. But Kalen didn't care about appearances anymore. The truth gnawed at him. She had looked at him as though his empire meant nothing, and somehow that made him feel more alive than any headline ever had. On his third day of searching, Kalen stepped into a modest shelter tucked between two crumbling brick buildings. The air smelled faintly of soup and old books, and children's laughter echoed faintly down the hall. At first he thought his search would end in another disappointment. Then he heard it, soft, uneven notes strummed on a guitar. He followed the sound to a corner room. There she was. Ilara sat cross-legged on the floor, a boy no older than 10 beside her, watching with wide eyes. The guitar was cracked along its frame, the strings dull and loose. With careful hands, Ilara tightened the pegs and tested each note, coaxing life back into the worn instrument. "Try now," she encouraged, her voice gentle. The boy plucked a string, and though the sound wavered, it carried a fragile kind of hope. Kalen stood at the doorway, transfixed. It wasn't just that she could fix things, it was how she did it. She leaned close, patient and kind, as though the boy's joy mattered more than the broken wood in her hands. When she smiled at the faint music that filled the room, Kalen realized he was witnessing something he had never seen in his world of boardrooms and contracts, someone who gave without expecting anything back. And for the first time, the billionaire who thought he had seen everything felt like he was seeing something new. Kalen didn't approach her immediately that day. He stood in the doorway longer than he intended, letting the boy's laughter and the timid strumming of the repaired guitar wash over him. Ilara looked so at ease there, kneeling on the floor, hair falling loosely across her face, smiling at each imperfect note. For someone with so little, she carried herself with a quiet assurance that seemed unshakable. In the days that followed, Kalen returned. Sometimes he found her mending broken toys, other times patching coats donated to the shelter. Each time he stayed nearby, offering little more than a greeting at first, but slowly small exchanges grew into conversations. She would glance up, surprised that he kept showing up, and he would offer an awkward smile, unsure why words felt so clumsy around her. The distance between their lives should have been a wall, yet it began to thin. Kalen asked questions, not about her circumstances, but about the things she loved to fix, the stories behind the objects she saved. Ilara, wary at first, answered in short sentences, but over time, her guard softened. She realized he wasn't mocking her, nor was he there out of pity. Each conversation felt like a thread pulling them closer, weaving something fragile yet undeniable between them. What began as chance was slowly becoming connection. One evening, after volunteering hours at the shelter, Ilara walked down the street carrying her ever-present toolkit. The city was quieter at night, neon lights buzzing above nearly empty sidewalks. Kalen, who had been waiting in his car nearby, stepped out and fell into stride beside her. "There's a cafe still open around the corner," he offered. "Join me for a cup of coffee?" Ilara hesitated. Cafes were luxuries she rarely allowed herself. But there was something disarming in the way he asked, not as a billionaire extending charity, but as a man hoping for company. She nodded, and together they slipped inside the small, warmly lit shop. They sat in a booth near the window, steam rising from mismatched mugs. At first, the conversation was simple. Talk about the weather, a passing remark about the city's relentless pace. Yet as the minutes stretched, the words deepened. Ilara spoke of the joy she found in fixing discarded things, of how every object had a story worth saving. Kalen, in turn, shared fragments of his own life, the long hours, the endless meetings, the pressure that came with every success. For Ilara, it was strange to see vulnerability in someone the world considered untouchable. For Kalen, it was strange to be heard without judgment, without expectation. That night, the cafe became more than a stop in the city. It became the first place where their walls began to crumble. Their late-night cafe talks became a quiet ritual, but sometimes words weren't necessary. On nights when the air was cool and the city's noise softened, Kalen would suggest a walk by the lake that curved just beyond the downtown streets. The water shimmered under the moonlight, rippling gently as if echoing their unspoken thoughts. Ilara often hugged her coat close, her toolkit hanging at her side, while Kalen matched her pace, his polished shoes crunching softly against the gravel path. They didn't always speak. Sometimes they let silence carry them, steps falling in rhythm with one another. For Ilara, those walks were rare moments where she felt safe. She didn't need to explain herself or hide the shadows of her past. For Kalen, the silence was freedom from a world that always demanded speeches and decisions. Beside her, he could simply exist. Occasionally, she would pause, staring out across the water. Kalen noticed how her eyes softened when the reflection of the city lights danced on the surface. It was as though she saw beauty in places most people overlooked, just as she did with broken objects. It was in those walks, under the watchful glow of the moon, that their bond grew in a way words could never capture. One evening, after another long walk, Kalen noticed a small tear along the sleeve of his shirt. Normally, he would have tossed it aside or had it replaced by one of his staff. But standing next to Ilara, the thought of discarding it felt almost shameful. She caught his glance at the frayed seam and raised an eyebrow. "Give it here," she said softly, reaching for the fabric. Kalen hesitated. "It's just a shirt. I'll buy another." Her lips curved into the faintest smile. "You don't need another. You just need to fix this one." From her toolkit, she pulled a small needle and thread, but instead of doing it herself, she placed them into his hand. "You try." He looked at her as though she had asked him to scale a mountain. His life had been filled with contracts and figures, not stitches and thread. But Ilara sat patiently, guiding his clumsy fingers as he struggled with the needle. Each time he fumbled, she steadied his hand, showing him the rhythm of weaving the thread back and forth. It was a simple repair, barely noticeable once finished, but to Kalen it felt monumental. For the first time, he had fixed something with his own hands, not for profit, not for applause, but simply to preserve what was already his. When he looked at her afterward, there was a new respect in his eyes. She hadn't just taught him to mend a shirt, she had shown him that not everything broken needs replacing. Sometimes it just needs care. Their closeness didn't bloom in grand gestures. There were no glittering diamonds or extravagant declarations. Instead, it grew in the simplest of ways, the kind most people might overlook. One evening, as they shared a modest meal at the cafe, Kalen slid a plate of bread across the table. Ilara tore it in half and offered him the larger piece without thinking. He laughed softly, amused at how easily she gave without hesitation. Later, when she took a sip of his coffee by mistake, they both laughed harder than the moment deserved, the sound spilling freely into the quiet shop. During their walks, their hands would sometimes brush against each other. Neither pulled away immediately. Instead, the brief contact lingered, sending a warmth through Kalen that no luxury had ever stirred. For Ilara, those fleeting touches were terrifying and comforting all at once, a reminder that she was no longer entirely alone. One night, when rain threatened again, they shared a single umbrella. Their shoulders pressed close, and though neither spoke of it, both knew the silence between them carried more meaning than any carefully chosen words. It was in these ordinary moments, shared food, gentle laughter, quiet touches, that something extraordinary began to take shape. Their bond was not built on spectacle, but on the steady heartbeat of human connection. For all the warmth growing between them, Alara carried shadows she could not easily set aside. Trust, for her, was not something freely given. Too many promises in her past had been broken. Too many hands had turned away when she reached for help. She remembered nights when she was younger, standing at doors that never opened, asking for work that never came. She remembered being let down by people who swore they would stay but vanished when hardship grew heavy. Those memories had taught her that to depend on others was to invite disappointment. So when Kalen's kindness pressed closer, she hesitated. She could laugh with him, share meals, even enjoy the quiet of their walks. But opening her heart felt dangerous. What if his interest faded? What if he woke up one day and decided she was nothing more than a passing curiosity? Kalen noticed the way her eyes sometimes clouded when he reached for her hand. He saw how she pulled back from conversations that touched too deeply on her past. He didn't push. Instead, he listened, leaving space for her to share only when she was ready. Alara wanted to believe in him. She wanted to believe that not everyone would leave, that not everyone measured her worth by what she lacked. But believing was harder than repairing a broken guitar or tightening loose bolts. It was a risk her heart wasn't sure it could take. Kalen had spent most of his life speaking, commanding, and being heard. In boardrooms, his voice dictated futures. In interviews, his words filled headlines. People leaned in when he talked, not because they cared, but because they feared missing a chance to align with his influence. He was used to being the center of every conversation. But with Alara, something shifted. He realized quickly that if he wanted to know her, he couldn't fill the silence with his own stories. He had to listen, truly listen. So he asked gentle questions and allowed her pauses to linger. When she hesitated, he didn't rush her. When her words faltered, he didn't finish them for her. It was during one of their late-night walks that she finally spoke of her past. Her voice was low, steady, recounting hardships without dramatics. Nights spent in shelters, moments of betrayal, the ache of being invisible to the world. Kalen didn't interrupt. He kept his eyes on the path ahead, giving her the safety of speaking without judgment. For perhaps the first time in his life, Kalen found value not in what he could say, but in the silence he offered. Listening became his act of devotion, his way of showing her that her voice mattered more than his reputation. And as Alara's words spilled into the night air, something inside him began to repair, too. By now, their bond was no longer just chance encounters and quiet conversations. It had become something the people around them could see, even if unspoken. At the cafe, the owner smiled knowingly when they walked in together, setting their usual mugs on the table without being asked. At the shelter, children who once ran to Alara now tugged at Kalen's sleeves too, unafraid of the man in the expensive coat. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a sudden confession or sweeping gesture. Instead, it was a slow unfolding, two lives blending, piece by piece, like threads carefully stitched into fabric. Viewers following their story would find themselves leaning in, waiting for each step, rooting for them with every glance exchanged and every barrier gently lowered. Kalen had stopped being the untouchable figure perched on a pedestal. With Alara, he was simply a man, awkward at times, humbled, learning how to share rather than command. Alara, once hidden in the shadows of survival, now found herself laughing, teaching, and walking beside someone who valued her voice. Their connection wasn't flawless, but it was real. And that authenticity was what made it powerful. Each moment drew them closer, until their story was no longer about a billionaire and a homeless girl. It was about two human beings daring to believe that healing and love were possible. For years, Kalen's life had been a cycle of flights, boardrooms, and endless negotiations. His schedule was filled with carefully crafted agendas, each day another climb up a ladder that had already reached the clouds. But despite all his accomplishments, each night ended the same: an empty penthouse, silent halls, and a man who stared out at the city lights feeling utterly alone. That began to change with Alara. Every moment spent with her stirred something inside him he had nearly forgotten: life. Not the life of profit margins and stock prices, but the life that comes with laughter, small discoveries, and the comfort of human connection. He found himself replaying her words at odd times, hearing her voice in his mind as clearly as if she stood beside him. He remembered the way her hands guided his when she taught him to sew, the way her eyes softened as she listened to the boy play the repaired guitar, the way silence felt like companionship when they walked by the lake. These were not grand achievements or headlines, yet they filled him more deeply than any award ever had. One night, as he left her at the shelter, Kaylin realized something startling. He was smiling without forcing it, the kind of smile that reached his eyes, born not from power but from presence. For the first time in years, Kaylin felt not like a man performing a role, but like a man living. Kaylin's world of excess had always demanded his presence. Invitations to galas arrived daily, contracts required his signature, and his calendar was a battlefield managed by assistants. Yet, slowly, he began turning down those engagements. The champagne gatherings, the endless speeches, the carefully staged photographs, they no longer held him. Instead, his thoughts drifted toward a modest cafe table, a walk by the lake, or the quiet satisfaction of simply hearing Ilara speak. His staff noticed first. Meetings once held at his penthouse were postponed. He excused himself from social events that had once been mandatory for maintaining his reputation. Some whispered that he was distracted, but Kaylin didn't care. The truth was, he had grown tired of hollow luxury. For the first time, the wealth surrounding him felt not like a blessing, but like a cage he no longer wished to sit inside. When he spent time with Ilara, there was no need to impress. She didn't care about his fortune. In fact, she seemed to prefer moments stripped of extravagance, an inexpensive meal, a seat by the shelter's worn piano, a walk along a path damp with rain. And Kaylin found himself drawn to those simple spaces where he could laugh freely, stumble over unfamiliar tasks, and be seen as something more than a name on financial reports. It was not an abandonment of his empire, but a shift. He began to realize that living did not mean maintaining the perfect image. It meant choosing where his heart felt at home. And increasingly, that home was wherever Ilara stood. For most of her life, Ilara's thoughts had been ruled by survival. Each day was measured in small victories, finding a dry place to rest, holding on to food long enough to quiet the ache in her stomach, or keeping her toolkit safe so she could earn dignity by repairing what others discarded. She never allowed herself to dream beyond that. Dreaming felt dangerous. Hope could break a heart faster than hunger ever could. But being with Kaylin began to shift something within her. At first, she resisted the change. When he laughed at her dry jokes or listened without interruption to her memories, she reminded herself that this couldn't last. Yet the more time they spent together, the harder it became to ignore the quiet voice inside her whispering, "Maybe you deserve more than just survival." She noticed it in small ways. When Kaylin carried an umbrella large enough to shield them both, she allowed herself to step closer rather than walking apart. When he asked her opinion, not out of courtesy but with genuine curiosity, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. He wasn't trying to fix her. He was simply honoring her presence. For the first time in years, Ilara began imagining a life beyond benches and borrowed blankets. Perhaps there was room for something steady, something kind, something hers. The possibility frightened her, but it also lit a spark she couldn't ignore. She didn't yet believe fully in forever, but she was beginning to believe in tomorrow. And that alone was more than she had ever dared to claim. The first sign of trouble came not from Kaylin's world of meetings or investments, but from whispers that spread in places where wealth thrived on appearances. His rival, Silas, had built a reputation on sharp suits and sharper words. He thrived on humiliating competitors, delighting in any opportunity to chip away at Kaylin's image. One evening, at a corporate dinner crowded with executives, Silas leaned across the polished table with a smirk. "I hear you've found yourself new company, Kaylin," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to overhear. "Not the usual arm candy your circles expect. A girl from the streets, wasn't it? Fixes chairs and toys instead of portfolios?" His laughter echoed, cruel and calculated. Kaylin's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, unwilling to let Silas bait him in front of an audience. Yet the mockery spread beyond that room. Within days, tabloids picked up on it. Headlines appeared, "Billionaire spotted with mysterious woman, not from his world, and Kaylin's fall from elegance." Photographers lingered outside the cafe where he and Ilara often met, hoping for a scandalous shot. The media twisted kindness into weakness, portraying Alara as a distraction that tarnished his reputation. Some speculated she was after his wealth, others painted him as a man losing his edge. And though Alara tried to ignore the noise, Kaylin could see how the whispers weighed on her. For him, the decision was clear. Her presence was not a liability, but a lifeline. Yet the world he came from had little patience for choices of the heart. The conflict had begun, not with fists or contracts, but with something far more cutting: public judgment. And so, my friends, the story takes a sharper turn. What began as quiet moments of repair and discovery now faces the weight of outside judgment. Kaylin, once untouchable in his world of wealth, is suddenly the subject of whispers. Alara, who had only just begun to believe in something beyond survival, now finds herself at the center of ridicule she never asked for. This raises a question I'd like to bring directly to you. Have you ever been judged for who you chose to love, or for the person you decided to stand beside? Maybe friends questioned your choice. Maybe family doubted you. Or maybe strangers cast opinions as if they had the right to decide the value of your heart. It is never easy to face criticism when your happiness does not fit into someone else's expectations. Yet, often, it is in those moments of doubt from others that our convictions are tested most deeply. Kaylin and Alara's story is about to show us just how powerful those choices can be. But before we move forward, I'd love for you to pause and share your own experience in the comments below. Tell us, have you stood by someone despite the world's opinion? Or have you ever been that person judged unfairly? Your story matters, and your voice could encourage someone else listening tonight who feels the same weight. And as we continue, remember, the heart does not ask for permission from society, it only asks for courage. The ballroom glittered with chandeliers, their crystals scattering light across silk gowns and tailored suits. The annual charity gala was always a spectacle, attended by the wealthiest and most influential figures in the city. Kaylin had walked these halls many times before, always greeted by flashing cameras and eager hands reaching for handshakes. Tonight, however, felt different. Whispers had already filled the room before he arrived. Silas's mocking words had spread like fire through boardrooms and media outlets, and now every guest was waiting for confirmation. Who was this mysterious woman who had captured the attention of the city's most untouchable man? Alara entered beside Kaylin, dressed simply but with quiet dignity. She wore a borrowed dress, its seams neatly mended, paired with shoes she had polished herself. She did not blend in with the jeweled guests, yet her presence carried something stronger than glitter: authenticity. Heads turned as she walked. Some eyes narrowed, others widened in disbelief. The reporters wasted no time. Microphones pushed forward, cameras snapped. "Mr. Kaylin, who is she?" one demanded. "Is she truly the woman we've seen you with?" asked another. "How does she fit into your world?" Kaylin felt the air shift. The gala, once a place of scripted pleasantries, had become a stage. He could hear the weight in every question, the demand for him to either confirm or deny the truth. Behind him, Silas smirked from across the room, clearly savoring the moment. Beside him, Alara stood still, her fingers brushing the fabric of her dress. She didn't flinch, but he could sense her unease. The storm outside had been easier than this, the storm of judgment waiting for his answer. The questions struck like arrows, sharp and insistent. Each reporter pressed closer, eager to capture the headline that would ripple across the city by morning. Kaylin felt the familiar pressure, the kind that had shaped his career. He knew how to turn words into weapons, how to dodge questions with polished charm. Tonight he could do the same. He could deny her. A simple shake of his head, a dismissive laugh, and the cameras would move on. Alara would fade back into obscurity, and his empire would remain untouched. It would be the easiest choice, the expected choice. Or he could hide her. He could shield her with vague responses, speak of friendship or charity work, reducing her presence to something harmless, something temporary. That way, he would protect her from the scrutiny and keep his image intact. His advisors would praise him. His investors would breathe easy. But as he stood there, the weight of those options pressed heavy on his chest. He turned his head slightly and saw her. Alara wasn't pleading with him, wasn't begging for rescue. She stood quietly, chin raised, dignity intact despite the storm of voices. She had walked into this room knowing she didn't belong, yet she faced it without flinching. Kaelin's pulse quickened. He remembered the night in the rain, her words cutting through thunder. Machines don't care about titles. She had refused his money, refused to bend to the rules of his world. She'd given him something he hadn't known how to name, truth. And now the truth demanded more of him than any business deal ever had. Would he protect his status, or would he protect her? Would he let the world define their bond, or would he claim it himself? For the first time in years, Kaelin realized he was standing at a choice that mattered, not to his empire, but to his soul. The room seemed to close in, the murmurs rising, cameras waiting for their prize. Kaelin's heart pounded louder than the noise, not from fear of the press, but from the decision he knew he could no longer delay. Slowly he reached for Alara's hand, his palm pressed against hers, warm and steady. The reporters leaned forward, microphones poised, eager for a denial or an excuse. But Kaelin's voice rose above them all, calm yet unshakable. "She's the one who taught me what I never knew," he said, his words carrying across the ballroom like a bell tolling in silence, "that nothing is too broken to be repaired. Not even me." The reaction was instant. Gasps rippled through the crowd, followed by a flurry of camera flashes that lit the room like lightning. Journalists scrambled to record every syllable, each one certain they had captured the headline of the year. Kaelin didn't flinch. His grip on Alara's hand tightened, not out of desperation but conviction. He looked not at the reporters, not at Silas smirking in the corner, but at Alara herself. His gaze held gratitude, resolve, and something far deeper than words could capture. For Alara, the world blurred. The lights, the voices, the relentless pressure, it all faded when she heard those words. No one had ever spoken of her that way, as though her worth was undeniable, as though her quiet strength mattered more than appearances. In that moment, Kaelin chose her, not as a secret, not as a shameful distraction, but as the person who had mended what all his wealth could not. He didn't hide her from the world, he placed her at its center. The moment Kaelin's words struck the air, the ballroom erupted. Gasps rose from the crowd like a wave crashing against the marble walls. Some guests clutched their pearls, others whispered behind manicured hands, and the press surged forward, cameras firing in rapid bursts as though they might capture the very heartbeat of the confession. Flashes lit the room in blinding white, but Kaelin did not look away. He stood tall, Alara's hands still secure in his own. For a man who had once measured every move for its political or financial advantage, this choice was reckless. Yet it was the first decision in years that felt honest. Silas, standing off to the side, sneered in disbelief. His smirk faltered when he realized that Kaelin was not backtracking, not hiding, but standing firmly in the storm of judgment with no trace of apology. The rival, who thrived on humiliation, now found no foothold. Kaelin's certainty turned mockery into irrelevance. The guests, stunned at first, began to shift. Some frowned, unwilling to understand. Others softened, their rigid expressions loosening as they saw the sincerity in Kaelin's words. There was something undeniable about the way he looked at Alara, something that silenced doubt more effectively than any argument. For Alara, the noise and light threatened to overwhelm, but Kaelin's hand anchored her. She had walked into the gala fearing she would be exposed as less, but instead she was lifted, not by riches or spectacle, but by the simple truth of being chosen, openly and without shame. The risk was staggering. Kaelin knew the fallout would come. Critical articles, skeptical investors, whispers from so-called allies. Yet, standing there beneath the blaze of cameras, he felt a strange kind of relief. For once, he was not hiding behind wealth or reputation. He was standing in love, unguarded and proud. And for the first time, the crowd saw not just a billionaire or a girl from the streets, but two people who had dared to claim something real. The storm of cameras eventually settled into a steady rhythm, the hum of voices filling the ballroom. Yet, in the center of it all, Kaelin and Alara stood as though no one else existed. His declaration had been bold, reckless even, but the truth of it glowed in every detail. The unwavering hold of his hand, the pride in his eyes, the calm with which he faced the frenzy. For years, Kaelin had been defined by numbers, by headlines that charted his victories and critics, who measured his worth against the size of his empire. Tonight, None of that mattered. He was no longer a figure of status, but a man who had chosen love in its simplest, most unpolished form. The weight of his empire suddenly felt lighter, as if all the noise of expectation had been stripped away by 4 simple words. She taught me, Alara, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment, felt her chest tighten with something she hadn't known in years: acceptance. She had braced herself for shame, for whispers that would remind her she didn't belong. Instead, Kaylin's courage wrapped around her like a shield. For the first time, she wasn't invisible, and she wasn't pitied. She was seen, valued, cherished. The room's energy shifted. Among the doubtful stares, a murmur of admiration spread. A woman near the front wiped away a tear. A man who had built his life on power had chosen something no contract could guarantee, and in that choice, he had exposed the hollowness of the world that mocked him. Love had triumphed over status, not through spectacle, but through sincerity, and in that triumph, both Kaylin and Alara stood freer than they had ever been. He, unchained from the weight of expectation; she, lifted from the shadows of survival into the light of belonging. That night, the gala would be remembered not for its wealth or its grandeur, but for the moment when a man of fortune risked everything to declare that true worth lies not in possessions, but in love that dares to stand firm in the face of the world. The months following the gala were not easy. Headlines still circled, investors raised their brows, and Silas continued his barbed remarks. Yet none of that stopped Kaylin from keeping his word. He had declared Alara as his choice, and he lived that truth every day afterward. One of his first promises was not to change her, but to help her bring her quiet dreams to life. And so, together, they found a small brick building tucked into the corner of the city, a place that smelled faintly of dust and forgotten potential. Where others saw an old space with peeling paint and cracked windows, Alara saw possibility. With Kaylin's resources and her vision, the building transformed. Wooden tables were set in neat rows, shelves filled with tools, jars of nails, screws, and bolts neatly organized. Sunlight poured in through freshly cleaned windows, falling across piles of items waiting to be mended: broken chairs, faded toys, even old radios brought in by curious neighbors. A sign hung above the door in simple lettering: Alara's Workshop. This was not Kaylin's empire. It was not another acquisition, not a business model drafted on paper. It was Alara's world, built on her skill, her resilience, and her belief that repair was more than fixing objects. It was restoring dignity, one piece at a time. For the first time, Alara had a place that was hers, a place not borrowed, not temporary, not fragile, a place where broken things were welcomed, and where broken hearts found the courage to keep going. From the very first week, the workshop became more than just a space to repair objects. It became a gathering place for those who had long been told they had nothing to offer. Children from nearby shelters arrived with toys clutched in their arms, their eyes wide with hope. Women came hesitantly at first, carrying small items: an old kettle, a pair of shoes, a broken picture frame. They came expecting Alara to fix these things for them, but she didn't. Instead, she placed the tools in their hands. "Here," she would say gently, guiding their fingers around a screwdriver or threading a needle for them. "You can do it yourself. Let me show you how." The first attempts were clumsy. Screws slipped, stitches tangled, wires bent the wrong way. But Alara's patience never faltered. She celebrated every effort, every small improvement, every moment someone looked at their own work with a flicker of pride. Slowly, the workshop filled with not only repaired objects but also the sound of laughter, of voices rising in shared learning. One boy, once too shy to speak above a whisper, strummed a guitar he had helped restore, his smile brighter than the sunlight streaming through the windows. A woman who had lost nearly everything clutched a chair she had mended, running her hands over the smooth, sturdy surface with tears in her eyes. Alara knew she wasn't just teaching them to fix things. She was teaching them to see themselves as capable, valuable, and worthy of care. Each repaired object became a reminder. If a broken toy or chair could be made whole again, so could they. The workshop was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who walked through its doors. Kaylin had stood at the center of countless celebrations in his life. He had raised glasses with world leaders, accepted awards on gilded stages, and been applauded for achievements that filled headlines. Yet none of those moments compared to the sight of Alara's workshop buzzing with life. He often slipped in quietly, sitting near the back as children clustered around tables and women leaned over their projects, guided by Alara's calm voice. He watched her move from person to person, her hands steady, her smile encouraging, her presence transforming the room. To him, this was more powerful than any empire. This was impact he could feel. For years he had chased the illusion that money could fill the hollowness within him. But wealth had only built higher walls. Now, standing in that workshop, Kalen felt those walls crumble. He wasn't admired for his fortune here, nor was he feared for his influence. He was simply Kalen, a man welcomed, not for his wealth, but for his willingness to stand beside Alara and share in her vision. Sometimes she handed him tools and pulled him into the lessons. He found himself teaching a boy how to tighten screws or helping an older woman balance a chair leg. His hands, once skilled only at signing contracts, began to know the weight of a hammer, the precision of aligning gears, the patience of trial and error. Each moment in that workshop stitched him closer to a sense of wholeness he had never known, not the hollow fullness of possessions, but the deep, steady fullness of belonging to a purpose, belonging to someone who had seen through his walls and belonging to himself at last. Life for Kalen and Alara didn't become a fairy tale overnight. There were no castles, no sweeping ballrooms. Instead, their love grew in the ordinary rhythm of days, and it was there in the simplicity that their bond deepened most. Mornings often began at the workshop. Alara brewed tea in a chipped kettle while Kalen swept the floor before children and women arrived. They teased each other over who made the stronger tea, laughter warming the air before the first visitor even stepped through the door. Afternoons were filled with quiet teamwork. Sometimes Alara patched fabric while Kalen sanded wood, the two working side by side in comfortable silence. Other times they traded jokes, their laughter echoing off the workshop's walls as though the room itself were alive with joy. Evenings belonged to them alone. They shared simple dinners, bread, soup, fruit bought fresh from the market. Often Kalen insisted on cooking, though his attempts usually ended in burnt toast or overcooked pasta. Alara would laugh, shaking her head, but she always ate every bite, touched by his effort rather than the taste. And on nights when the day had been long, they returned to the lake. Their footsteps crunched softly against the gravel path, their hands brushing, then intertwining, as the moon watched over them. They didn't need to speak much. The silence was enough, a silence filled with trust, presence, and the unspoken promise of a future neither had dared to dream before. These everyday moments, stitched together, became the fabric of their love. It was not grand, but it was steady, and in its steadiness, they found the kind of happiness both had been searching for all along. The lake had become their sanctuary, a place where silence was not heavy but safe. One evening, as the water reflected the soft glow of twilight, Kalen stopped walking. The gravel path crunched beneath his shoes, and Alara turned to find him studying her with an expression more serious than usual. He reached for her hand, holding it carefully, almost reverently. For once there was no crowd, no flashing cameras, no stage demanding his performance. It was just them, the lake, and the rustle of leaves. "Alara," he began, his voice steady but gentle. "I've spent years fixing everything outside of me, companies, contracts, appearances. But you showed me something I didn't understand before. You taught me that life itself can be repaired." Her breath caught, and her eyes softened. He smiled faintly, squeezing her hand. "So I'm asking you, not with a ring, not with promises written on paper, but with the only words that matter to me now. Will you keep repairing life with me?" The lake seemed to still in that moment, the ripples pausing as though even the water waited for her reply. Alara stared at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of love and fear. The proposal was not grand, not polished, but it was real, so real that it shook her more than any glittering gesture ever could. She had never dreamed of diamond rings or lavish ceremonies. What she had longed for, quietly and desperately, was someone who would stay. Her lips trembled into a smile, though her eyes glistened. "Kalen," she whispered, "you've seen me when I had nothing, and you never turned away." You've taught me that trust doesn't always lead to pain, but I need you to understand something." He leaned closer, waiting, his hand still cradling hers. "I'll say yes," she continued softly, "but only if you promise not to give up when it gets hard. Life isn't always kind. There will be days when things break again, when trust is tested, when silence feels heavy. If we're to repair life together, it has to be with patience, no matter how rough it gets." Kalen's throat tightened. He nodded, the promise already written in his heart. "Then it's a promise. No giving up. Not now, not ever." And with that, her smile widened into something brighter than any jewel. Her answer was not just acceptance, it was a vow of her own. Their wedding day was nothing like the world expected for a man of Kalen's stature. There were no glittering halls filled with reporters, no orchestra playing for hundreds of guests. Instead, it was quiet, almost secret, held by the lake that had borne witness to their story. Beneath the sweeping branches of a willow tree, they stood side by side. A few close faces gathered, the children from the shelter who had strummed guitars with Alara, the women who had learned to mend chairs and patch fabrics in her workshop, and a handful of Kalen's most trusted friends who valued him as a man, not as a figure of wealth. The ceremony was simple. The vows were not written in elaborate language but spoken from the heart. Kalen promised to remain steady even in silence, to protect without possession, to love without condition. Alara promised to keep teaching him the value of small things, to stand firm when life felt fragile, and to remind him that every broken piece could be mended. When they exchanged their first kiss as husband and wife, it was not accompanied by cheers from a crowd or the glare of cameras. It was held in stillness, under branches swaying gently in the breeze, the lake glimmering quietly in the background. It was not a spectacle, it was a promise lived out in simplicity. And so, their story found its peace, not in headlines or riches, but in the quiet assurance of two people who chose each other when the world said they did not belong. Kalen, once defined by power, had discovered that true strength is not in building empires, but in learning to be vulnerable. Alara, once defined by loss, had discovered that love could mend more than objects, it could mend the soul. Sometimes we believe only grand achievements will give our lives meaning. Yet here was a man who owned everything and found nothing in it, and a woman who owned almost nothing yet gave him everything he lacked. Their lives remind us that worth isn't measured by wealth or appearances, but by the courage to see value where others do not. And maybe that is the lesson for us all. Sometimes the greatest repairs in life aren't of machines, but of broken hearts and lonely souls. Sometimes what we need is not to be rescued, but to be seen, to be valued, and to be loved in our imperfections. Kalen and Alara's story isn't just theirs, it's a mirror. It asks us what or who in our lives might be waiting to be repaired with patience, kindness, and love. My friends, you've just walked through the journey of Alara and Kalen, two lives that seemed worlds apart yet found healing in each other. Their story is a reminder that love doesn't always arrive in grand gestures or perfect circumstances. Sometimes it's as simple as choosing to stand together, to repair what others might discard, and to believe that nothing is too broken to be made whole again. If this story touched you, I ask you to take a moment now to support this community. Click subscribe so you'll always be part of these evenings where love, lessons, and hope come alive. Press the like button if this story moved you, and share it with a friend or family member who might need to hear that even in the hardest moments, healing is possible. And don't forget to leave a comment below. I'd love to know what part of this story spoke to you the most. Together we can make sure more people hear stories that remind them that kindness still matters, that broken things and broken hearts can be repaired. So join us again next time right here at Tales by Williams. Until then, hold on to the truth that love and hope are never too broken to mend.